Imagine the deep, bone-chilling dampness of late autumn 1938. A heavy government car, gleaming with hoarfrost, affectionately nicknamed an Emka by the people, leisurely departs from the brightly lit streets of Moscow, still bustling with evening activity. The car dissolves into the thick, almost palpable fog of Kashirskoye Highway, carrying its sole passenger away from familiar reality. The man in the back seat, only yesterday an all-powerful people's commissar, a celebrated commander, or a brilliant diplomat whose name thundered on the pages of morning newspapers. He nervously adjusts the cuffs of his impeccably tailored suit and glances at his prestigious Swiss wristwatch, whose thin golden hands relentlessly count down the minutes until midnight. A heavy cocktail of smells hangs in the cramped cabin: the driver's cheap tobacco, the acrid gun grease of the accompanying persons, and the subtle, barely perceptible yet unmistakably recognizable scent of animal fear. The passenger frantically reviews recent events in his mind, convinced that he is being taken to the center of the capital, to familiar, brightly lit offices where he will be able to explain everything, where this monstrous, absurd mistake will surely be cleared up. Here we see a fatal error of perception. This outstanding man, accustomed to commanding armies, factories, and the destinies of millions, does not yet understand that he has already been erased from the fabric of existence. The car makes an unexpected sharp turn onto an inconspicuous dirt road, the wheels getting stuck in the autumn mud. And at that very moment, his former life ends forever. Ahead, from the impenetrable darkness, the massive brick walls of the former street. Catherine's Hermitage slowly rise, overwhelming in their weight. Welcome to Special Facility number 110, a place from which people do not return the same, and most often, do not return at all. But before we cross the threshold of this chilling architectural complex and begin our detailed investigation into the mechanics of human personality disintegration, I ask you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with your friends. Your activity is the only tool that helps us uncover the most hidden, intentionally obscured pages of the past, bringing back from artificial oblivion stories that someone very influential wanted to consign to eternal death oblivion. The history of this place is not just a dry chronicle of the development of the penitentiary system of a vast state. It is an incredibly deep, multi-layered psychological thriller set against the paradoxical backdrop of the 17th century. Originally, this magnificent monastery was founded by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich as a quiet, blessed place for deep spiritual reflection, solitude, and the search for divine light. The paradox of history is that 3 centuries later, these hallowed, prayer-soaked vaults became an ideal, mathematically precise acoustic resonator for absolute human despair. In the late 1930s, the country's top leadership and the architects of state security recognized an acute, insurmountable need to create a completely special, elite isolation facility. Existing complexes in the center of the capital, despite their frightening status and insurmountable walls, were deemed too noisy, too tightly integrated into the circulatory, pulsating system of the huge city. An absolute vacuum was required. A place where the laws of physics, time, and human morality would cease to function according to general rules. Historians still debate the reasons for choosing this particular monastery among dozens of other vacant religious sites in the Moscow region. The official, documented version dryly states that the complex was simply conveniently empty and suitable in terms of area. However, if we discard the bureaucratic formulations and propose to look at the logistics, topographical maps and climatic features of that time, a completely different, frightening picture emerges. The object was chosen due to its ideal natural windrows and unique terrain features. The monastery was located in a deep lowlands surrounded by dense forest, which created the effect of natural sound insulation. The wind carried any sounds away from the nearest villages, and the dense wall of trees literally muffled the echo. This was not just an isolation ward. It was an ingenious, sinister engineering project for the complete removal of a person from the space-time continuum. The inner courtyard greeted the first prisoners with an unnatural, surgically perfect order. The architects of the new order ruthlessly rebuilt the ancient monastic buildings to create a disorienting labyrinth in which even experienced guards lost their orientation in space during the first months of service. More than 50 cells and special rooms were designed with devilish, pedantic meticulousness. Few noticed that the main task of the builders was not to keep the prisoner inside. Escaping from there was physically impossible, but to prevent the outside world from entering the arrested person's consciousness. The walls of the ancient cells were covered with a special, multi-layered, sound-absorbing compound, the formula of which was developed in closed institutes. Incredibly thick, soft carpet runners were laid on the floors of the corridors. The footsteps of the overseers in soft shoes became absolutely silent, like the gliding of ghosts. The prisoner, finding himself inside his personal concrete box, instantly plunged into a ringing, heavy, unnatural silence that pressed on his eardrums more strongly than any noise. This silence was interrupted only by the rare, sharp, metallic clang of locks, which echoed in the brain like a hammer blow. In each cell, a lamp of enormous power, from 200 to 500 watts, burned continuously, without a single second of interruption, around the clock. It was cunningly hidden behind thick, impenetrable frosted glass on the ceiling, sometimes built into a special niche, so that the light evenly flooded every cubic centimeter of space. This unnatural, blinding, aggressive light mercilessly burned the retina, caused chronic migraines, and, most importantly, completely disrupted the human body's circadian rhythms. The window, if it was even provided by the original architecture of the cell, was closed by a massive, solid iron shield on the outside and a dense grating on the inside. Only a microscopic, narrow slit was left at the very top, through which, try as one might, it was impossible to see a single ray of sun or the glimmer of stars, only the gray, dismal edge of the concrete visor. A person deprived of the change of day and night very quickly lost understanding of what time of day it was, what day of the week, whether it was spring outside or a deep, frosty winter. Here we see the genius of the system's engineers. The main torture became not crude physical impact, which leaves traces and can cause fierce resistance, but the artificially distorted flow of time itself. Time within these walls stretched out, turning into a thick, viscous, suffocating substance in which all rational thought drowned. And here, the first crucial psychological archetype of this unwritten drama steps onto the historical stage, the archetype of the bureaucrat of emptiness. Those who conducted interrogations at Special Facility Number 110 rarely resembled cinematic, caricatured villains with burning, insane eyes and rolled-up sleeves. Reality was far more terrifying in its ordinariness. These were methodical, calm, often tired, middle-aged people in perfectly ironed, clean tunics. They smelled of good perfume, fresh tobacco, and office paste. They came to their specific work like engineers to a factory shift, meticulously arranging papers on the table, sharpening pencils. Their task was not merely to obtain some formal signature under a confession. For this routine, simpler institutions existed. Their highest professional goal was the complete, irreversible dismantling of the personality of a particularly important prisoner. They employed grueling, multi-day interrogations, representing a complex psychological game. The scheme was perfected to a frightening automatism and based on a deep understanding of human physiology. The prisoner was deprived of a fundamental basic need, the right to sleep. Imagine a person who is not allowed to close their eyes for 3, 5, sometimes 7 or 10 consecutive days. In the cell during the day, the folding bunk was fastened to the wall, and sitting on the tiny stool screwed to the floor was allowed only in a strictly defined posture, with hands on knees and looking straight ahead. The slightest closing of the eyes was immediately punished by a sharp shout or a knock on the door. At night, when the exhausted body demanded rest, the endless conveyor belt of interrogations began. A person whose consciousness was already balancing on the edge of reality and delirium from extreme exhaustion of the nervous system was brought into a spacious, well-furnished office with a massive oak table. The interrogator, that same bureaucrat of emptiness, could behave in a disarmingly polite manner. He might speak in a quiet, measured, almost sympathetic voice, offer hot, sweet tea in a glass with a silver holder, casually push over cigarettes of the same prestigious brand that the arrested person smoked in freedom. This incredible, pattern-breaking contrast between the absolute inhuman isolation of the concrete cell and the sudden illusion of normal human communication in the office broke the psyche more reliably and quickly than any overt threats. The person instinctively reached for this surrogate warmth, beginning to believe that the interrogator was their only ally in this absurd nightmare. It is precisely here, at this point of extreme, unbearable tension of human strength and meaning, that I want to interrupt our immersion and ask you directly. Write in the comments how you would try to maintain sanity in conditions of absolute information isolation, total sleep deprivation, and continuous, sophisticated psychological pressure. What internal philosophical anchors, what memories or beliefs could prevent your consciousness from inevitable disintegration? Your sincere answers are extremely important for our shared understanding of the nature of human resilience, and your comments, among other things, raise this video in the algorithm's output, allowing other thoughtful viewers to join our complex historical discussion. Continuing our investigation into the logic of this isolated world, we inevitably encounter a second, no less vivid and tragic archetype, that of the fallen Titan. The contingent of this closed territory was by no means comprised of random passers-by or petty offenders. These were the elite of the state, marshals who commanded multi-million-strong armies, people's commissars who built gigantic industrial sectors, prominent international diplomats whose words altered state borders, and influential party theoreticians who shaped the thoughts of millions. These were people of colossal will, undeniable authority, and steel resolve. People who, in a bitter twist of fate, had themselves for many years created, strengthened, and nourished the very ruthless system that was now methodically grinding down their own destinies. The internal conflict of these powerful individuals bore the character of a truly ancient tragedy, where the hero perishes by his own passions and creations. They sincerely, to the depths of their souls, believed in the idea for the triumph of which they had for many years unhesitatingly sent other, less fortunate comrades to their demise. And now, sitting in crumpled clothes, devoid of buttons and belts, On an iron stool bolted to the stone floor, they desperately tried to rationalize the absurdity unfolding around them. We can trace this phenomenon on a micro level. Take, for example, the story of a brilliant commander whose cavalry corps decided the outcomes of the largest battles of the early century. A man who had faced danger countless times, bearing many wounds, he encountered an enemy that could not be attacked with a saber or outflanked. This enemy was diffused in the very air of the cell. In the first days, such a prisoner usually displayed unyielding confidence. He demanded paper, wrote endless, passionate letters to the very top, to the head of state, sincerely believing that a ridiculous, monstrous mistake had occurred locally. He believed that enemies who had infiltrated the security agencies were concealing the truth from the leader. This saving illusion was their only psychological defense, their invisible armor. But the investigators, methodical bureaucrats of emptiness, knew how to work with such illusions. They did not argue. They simply waited until physical exhaustion did its work, and then carefully, like experienced surgeons, showed the arrested documents with resolutions, orders, and personal signatures of the very top leaders whom these marshals had served so fervently, so devotedly, their entire conscious lives. At this moment, the most terrible thing happened, the collapse of faith. The person understood that there was no justice system, no logic, no past merits. There was only a soulless machine, and it had already delivered its verdict. Here lies another important doubt in the official, established historical version. In memoirs and popular literature, it is generally believed that the General Commissar of State Security, whose name struck terror throughout the country, personally and regularly attended all key interrogations in this monastery, deriving sadistic pleasure from contemplating the downfall of his former government colleagues. However, if we impartially analyze the preserved visitor logs of the special facility, the travel manifests of his motorcade, and the overall logistics of his movements around the capital, we will see serious discrepancies. His demanding schedule of managing a gigantic repressive apparatus simply physically did not allow him to spend long, multi-hour nights in the dungeons of a remote monastery. I propose we look at this detail from a different angle. It is highly probable that the myth of his constant, unseen presence was cultivated within the prison absolutely deliberately. This was done to multiply the aura of the system's omnipotence and emphasize the inevitability of punishment. It was a masterful, subtle instrument of psychological suppression. The tormented, disoriented prisoner was always meant to feel with his skin that right now, behind a mirror, without amalgam, or in an adjacent dark room, stood that very all-powerful man, upon whose slightest eyebrow movement the end of his existence depended. The anticipation of a meeting with the chief inquisitor was more terrifying than the meeting itself. Total transformation in the tormented consciousness of the arrested usually occurred on the second or third week of continuous stay in this man-made vacuum. By this point, physical exhaustion reached a critical, terminal stage. Multiplied by acoustic deprivation and sensory starvation, the lack of sleep led to irreversible chemical changes in the brain. Powerful auditory and visual hallucinations began. Former People's Commissars and intellectuals, proud of their sharp, analytical minds, began to hear the voices of their small children or long-departed mothers in the noise of the ventilation. It seemed to them that a warm summer rain was falling in the cell, or that the walls were slowly but inexorably moving in, threatening to crush them flat. It was at this moment of profound vulnerability, when the boundary between reality and nightmare was completely erased, that methodical investigators delivered their calculated, final blow. They stopped playing at politeness. Direct threats against the closest people, wives, daughters, sons, were brought into play. Skillfully fabricated fake testimonies from former closest friends and party comrades who had allegedly already confessed and pointed to the prisoner as the main organizer of fantastic, absurd conspiracies were laid on the table. Imagine the state of a person. He hasn't slept for many days, his eyes are tearing from a 500-watt lamp, his legs are swollen to the state of logs from constant standing, emptiness rings in his ears, and on the table in front of him are papers proving that the entire world has turned its back on him. In this situation, the will broke. The most steadfast, those who had gone through wars and revolutions, turned into submissive, trembling shadows. They took the offered fountain pen, their hands wouldn't obey, the ink smeared across the paper, mixing with sweat. The prisoners signed blank forms or pre-typed, neatly printed multi-page protocols where he confessed to espionage for states whose languages he didn't know a single word of, to sabotage at factories he had never visited, and to preparing acts that were absurd even to conceive of. The denouement came frighteningly swiftly. As soon as a trembling, illegible signature appeared on the last page, the attitude towards the arrested changed instantly. After receiving the necessary papers, the person's value to the system immediately became zero. He turned into spent, useless material. It is important to understand a key thing. This special complex was never a place for long-term serving of an assigned sentence. It was a high-tech, soulless factory for producing confessions, a kind of combine for processing human stubbornness into neat, archival folders. As soon as the finished product in the form of a signed protocol was placed in the investigator's safe, the fate of the prisoner became absolutely predetermined. Many of the hundreds of outstanding figures of that era who passed through these endless carpeted corridors did not find the ultimate end of their life's journey here at all. The monastery territory remained clean. At night, in the same dense fog, they were led out into the inner courtyard, placed in closed cars without windows, and taken to special secret training grounds in other, even more remote areas of the Moscow region. But their true essence, their personality, their dignity, and their name were eliminated precisely here, in the cramped concrete cells of the former holy abode, to the accompaniment of indifferent silence. And here we come to the third, perhaps the most mysterious doubt concerning the chronology of this facility's existence. In available official archives, the closing date of the special prison most often appears around the early 50s, immediately after a radical change in the state's political course and the death of the system's chief architect. Departmental documents dryly, without emotion, report the disbandment of staff and the transfer of the historical complex to the jurisdiction of another, more peaceful ministry for the organization of an archive or warehouses there. However, if we turn to the memoirs of longtime residents of the surrounding villages, people who for decades were afraid even to turn their heads towards the closed forest zone, a completely different picture emerges. They whispered that at night, a dim, ominous light in the windows of the special isolated building continued to burn for many years after the official closure, and heavy, tarpaulin-covered trucks and black cars without license plates occasionally, but regularly, continued to turn off the main highway onto that very forest dirt road, disappearing behind high fences. Is it possible that the facility was only formally mothballed on paper? Or were those unique prisoners, whose very existence was forever erased from all conceivable lists and registers, still secretly held in its dungeons, hidden from any commissions? Ghost people, bearers of such secrets that could not be entrusted even to execution squads. The answer to this chilling question is still reliably hidden in those archives, the secrecy classification of which has not been lifted to this day, leaving a vast field for historical hypotheses and assumptions. Today, looking at the magnificently restored, gold-shining domes of the St. Catherine's Monastery in the rays of the spring sun, it is incredibly difficult for a modern person to imagine the unthinkable concentration of pain, despair, and broken destinies that permeates this Moscow region land for meters deep. The melodic, purifying chime of church bells has forever replaced the dry clang of heavy prison bolts. In the former cells, where people lost their minds, prayers are now heard again. But the lessons of this place remain frighteningly, incredibly relevant for any modern society. This deep, tragic story clearly, using examples of specific destinies, shows us how easily and imperceptibly the state machine, once endowed with absolute, uncontrolled power and reliably hidden by an impenetrable veil of total secrecy, turns into a blind, merciless instrument of absolute suppression. It teaches us the undeniable fact that any closed system, deprived of public control, an independent press, and transparent justice, inevitably begins to devour itself, starting the destruction precisely with those very people who enthusiastically stood at its origins and built its foundation. Complete isolation, absolute secrecy, conviction in one's own infallibility, and the complete absence of legal checks and balances. This is the dangerous concrete from which the most terrible institutions in the history of human civilization are built. A black government car returns to pre-dawn Moscow completely empty. The tired driver, his eyes red from lack of sleep, silently watches the gray ribbon of the road, asking his superiors no unnecessary questions. He is just a tiny, interchangeable cog in a gigantic, perfectly oiled, repressive mechanism that works without fail. The watch on his wrist continues to steadily tick away time. Time which, for someone back there, in the forest, has just stopped forever, frozen in the endless, blinding light under the ceiling. The thick fog over Kashirskoye Highway gradually dissipates under the first rays of the sun. A cold, invigorating morning of a new day arrives. The huge city awakens. People rush to factories, to institutes, buying fresh morning newspapers from kiosks to read about new labor records and очередных разоблачениях, treacherous enemies. None of these passers-by, hurrying about their business, knows, suspects, or should know about what has happened and is happening a few dozen kilometers from their warm apartments. Facility number 110 continues to reliably guard its grim secrets, remaining an eternal silent reproach to human cruelty and a formidable, unambiguous warning to future generations about how incredibly thin, transparent, and fragile is the boundary that separates civilized law from the abyss of absolute, uncontrolled arbitrariness.